The autumn wind whispered against the brittle panes of Dr. Adrian Mercer's study as he sat by the hearth. The fire's flicker casting restless shadows along the worn spines of his medical journals. Retirement had brought him a kind of uneasy peace, one punctuated by the steady tick of the grandfather clock, and the occasional letter from distant colleagues who still roamed the corridors of medicine where he no longer walked. His days passed quietly in Blackridge, a village that seemed forgotten by time, where cobblestone streets meandered past ivy-clad houses, and the only sounds were the cawing of crows and the restless sigh of trees. It was on such a day, gray with mist and heavy with silence, that the letter arrived. At first glance, it was an unremarkable thing. A simple envelope with his name, scrawled across the front in hurried ink. Yet the handwriting tugged at something in his memory, though he could not say what. Adrian's long, slender fingers trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal, the faint crack echoing louder than it should have in the still room. The paper inside was coarse beneath his fingertips, the script delicate yet desperate. It began formally, Dr. Mercer, I pray this letter finds you in good health, but quickly descended into an almost frantic plea for help. The writer, a woman by the name of Elara Wynne, implored him to come at once to the Hawthorne estate, a place he remembered hearing whispered about in passing long ago. According to her letter, her sister, Leora, had fallen into a strange and troubling condition, something the local doctors could not explain and seemed unwilling to treat. She described Leora as being alive in all the ways that mattered: breathing, her heart beating, steadily yet utterly absent, as though her soul had simply stepped out of her body and had not returned. Adrian frowned as he reread the lines, his practiced mind already scanning for clues. It wasn't just what Elora had written, but how she had written it. Each word seemed saturated with dread and an undercurrent of a sorrow so profound it seeped between the lines like invisible ink. Hawthorne Estate, she wrote, lay on the edge of the Blackmore woods, where the fog never quite lifted, and where rumors of strange occurrences were as thick as the moss that carpeted the trees. Adrian's rational mind, still sharp despite the years away from practice, scoffed at such superstitions, yet something in the letter's tone gnawed at him. There was a truth there, buried beneath fear and grief, and it pulled at him with a quiet urgency. He folded the letter carefully, laying it down upon his desk, but found his gaze drifting back to it over and over again as the day wore on. By evening, as the pale light drained from the sky and the first stars pricked holes in the blackness, he found himself packing a small valise. He included his old medical instruments, stethoscope, ophthalmoscope, reflex hammer, as well as a leather-bound notebook he hadn't opened in years. He lingered over the tools, running his fingers across the worn metal and cracked handles, memories of old cases flooding back in vivid flashes. Before he knew it, he was donning his long wool coat, the familiar weight settling over his shoulders like an old companion. Blackridge's narrow lanes were nearly deserted as he walked toward the train station, his boots echoing hollowly against the stone. He boarded the late-night train with few other passengers, most of whom kept their heads down and their collars turned up against the cold. The journey to Hawthorne Estate was not long in distance, but seemed to stretch endlessly as the countryside blurred past, dark and unfamiliar. At each stop, fewer and fewer people remained aboard until Adrian found himself alone. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks a steady counterpoint to his racing thoughts. He read Elora's letter again beneath the dim light of the carriage, noting how her desperation seemed to pulse beneath each carefully used, chosen phrase. She mentioned that Lyora had always been sensitive, able to sense things others could not, and that before her sudden withdrawal, she had spoken of feeling watched, followed by shadows that whispered her name. Adrian had treated many cases of hysteria in his time, had seen what grief and fear could do to the mind, yet something about this account unsettled him in a way he could not name. When the train finally hissed to a stop at the Blackmore crossing, he stepped onto the platform, finding the night thick with mist and the faint cry of some distant creature echoing through the trees. A carriage awaited him, black as pitch and driven by a silent man who nodded once before helping him inside. They traveled the winding road in near silence, save for the creak of the wheels and the rhythmic snort of the horses. Hawthorne Estate rose suddenly from the gloom, its iron gates yawning open as they approached. The mansion beyond loomed like a relic from another age, its many windows dark, save for one faint glow near the upper floor. As the carriage rolled to a stop, Adrian felt a chill pass through him that had little to do with the cold. He stepped down onto the gravel drive, his boots crunching softly, and paused as he looked up at the house. Somewhere within, a woman waited for him, a woman who believed her sister was slipping away into a darkness that medicine could not explain. And despite all his logic and learning, Adrian could not shake the feeling that by answering this letter, he had crossed an invisible threshold, stepping not just into an old house, but into something far older and more mysterious than he had ever known. The carriage rumbled to a stop in front of the sprawling structure that was Hawthorne Estate, its wheels crunching the gravel beneath in a slow, reluctant halt, as if even the horses knew to fear the place. Dr. Adrian Mercer sat still for a moment longer than he should have, his gloved hand resting on the door handle, his breath momentarily caught in his throat as he stared through the fogged window. The mansion loomed before him, half swallowed by mist, with ivy crawling up its weathered stone like veins on ancient skin. Towers jutted into the gray sky, their peaks jagged and sharp, as though the house itself had clawed its way from the ground long ago and then been forgotten by the world. The iron gates had groaned open earlier, as if on cue, without any visible hand to guide them. Now they stood like open jaws, welcoming him into a place where time seemed to have slowed, or perhaps stopped entirely. Steeling himself, Adrian pushed the door open and stepped down onto the drive. His boots sank slightly into the damp gravel, and the faint scent of wet earth and old decay hung heavy in the air. The carriage behind him retreated without a word, wheels kicking up the mist as it vanished down the winding path, leaving Adrian feeling as though he had crossed a bridge that no longer existed behind him. For a long breath, he simply stood there, his valise hanging by his side as he took in the dark windows that reflected nothing but a pall of gloom. Then, with measured steps, he approached the door, a massive oak thing scarred by age and weather. Just as he raised his hand to knock, the door creaked open a fraction, revealing a sliver of flickering candlelight and the faint, cold perfume of wilted flowers. There, standing in the doorway, was Elura Wynne. She looked younger than he had imagined from the letter, though weariness clung to her in ways that no number of years could measure. Her skin was pale, almost translucent in the candlelight, and her dark hair was pulled into a loose braid that fell over one shoulder, as though she had not the energy to tidy herself properly. But it was her eyes that struck him the most. Tired, yes, but alight with a fierce, unwavering hope that had clearly refused to dim, despite whatever darkness had rooted itself in this place. "Dr. Mercer," she said softly, her voice carrying the faintest tremor, whether from relief or fear, he could not tell. He gave her a polite nod, tipping his hat slightly as he crossed the threshold. The moment he stepped inside, it was as though he had entered another world. The air was heavier, almost thick, and carried with it the faint scent of something metallic, old blood or rust. He could not decide. The entryway was grand once, no doubt, with marble floors now dulled and cracked, and walls that bore portraits of long-dead ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow him as he passed. Ilara led him down a wide corridor, her footsteps making barely a sound upon the threadbare rugs. She explained in low, measured words that Leora had fallen ill some months ago. At first, it had seemed like simple exhaustion. Leora had always been sensitive, touched. Some in the village had whispered. She would often hear things, sense things that others did not. Ilara spoke of how her sister had been haunted by dreams of someone calling to her from beyond the trees, of a presence lingering just out of sight. And then, one morning, Leora simply did not wake up. She was found in her bed, breathing softly, as if in the gentlest of sleeps, her skin warm, her pulse strong. Yet no voice, no touch, no sound could rouse her. Adrian listened, his practiced mind quietly assessing, while another part of him, the part not governed by science, shivered beneath his coat. They climbed the wide, curving staircase, their shadows flickering against walls lined with ancestral faces, each portrait more faded and cracked than the last. At the top of the landing, Ilara paused beside a closed door, her hand resting on the tarnished brass handle for a moment before she pushed it open. The room beyond was cold, though a fire burned low in the grate, its light casting a fragile glow across the high ceiling. There, lying upon an ornately carved bed, draped in velvet and lace, was Leora. She was breathtaking in her stillness, her dark hair spread like ink across the white linen pillow, her face serene and pale, but for a faint flush at her cheeks. She might have been a bride awaiting her wedding morning, or a statue carved from marble by an adoring hand. Adrian approached with slow, respectful steps. He noted the regular rise and fall of her chest, the faint flutter of pulse at her throat. She was alive, unmistakably so, but she did not respond as he checked her reflexes, as he called her name softly. Her eyelids did not so much as flicker when he lifted them, though the pupils contracted obediently under his lamp's light. "And how long has she been like this?" he asked, his voice low. 7 weeks, Ilara answered. There was a quiet in her tone, an echo of something that had settled beyond grief, an acceptance of horror as part of daily life. Adrian nodded slowly, setting his valise down on a nearby chair and removing his instruments with steady hands. As he examined Leora, Ilara moved to the window, pushing aside the heavy curtains just enough to let in a shaft of cold, gray light. "She was always different," Ilara murmured, watching him without turning. "Our mother said Leora had the sight. She would speak of things before they happened. But this is not a vision. This is something else. Adrian made no reply, though her words settled heavy in his thoughts. He finished his examination in silence, returning his instruments to the bag with mechanical precision, though his mind churned with questions that had no immediate answer. Physically, Lyora seemed well, yet she was absent. "I will need time," he told Elora at last. "Time to observe, to think." Elora turned from the window then, her tired eyes searching his face for something reassurance, perhaps, or truth. "You will stay," she said, more than asked. Adrian gave a single nod. There was no question of leaving. Something in this place, in this girl, demanded his presence, though he could not have said why, as night deepened outside. Elora showed him to a guest room along the hall, its once grand furnishings now draped in sheets to keep the dust at bay. The wind rattled the windows as he unpacked, and from somewhere deep in the house, he thought he heard the faintest sound music, perhaps, or a whisper threading through the dark. Later, as he sat in the armchair by the fireplace, staring at the letter Elora had first sent him, he realized the house itself seemed to breathe. Its timbers creak in slow, rhythmic shifts, and the air carried a low, constant murmur that might have been wind or might have been something else. He did not sleep that night, nor did he try. The room where Lyora Wynne lay was oppressively quiet, as if sound itself had been dampened by the heavy velvet curtains and the thick tapestries that hung like sentinels along the walls, their colors faded by time and sorrow. Dr. Adrian Mercer entered with measured steps, the soles of his boots muffled by the dense carpeting, his breath shallow as he took in the unsettling stillness of the space. The fire in the marble hearth burned low, its glow soft and flickering, casting restless shadows that danced along the edges of the high ceiling and made the carved moldings writhe as though alive. The faint scent of dried lavender and something older, an earthy, metallic tang that tugged at the edge of his memory, hung in the cold air. At the center of the room, in a great four-poster bed of dark wood, inlaid with intricate symbols worn smooth by generations of hands, lay Lyora. She was slight, delicate, her frame barely disturbing the thick, embroidered quilts that covered her from waist to toe. Her skin was pale, but not sickly, like porcelain with the faintest trace of warmth still lingering beneath. Long, dark hair, deep brown with glimmers of auburn when the firelight touched it, fanned across the pillow like spilled ink, its ends disappearing into the lacework of the pillowcase. But it was her eyes that drew him in and held him wide open, staring upward at the shadowed canopy of her bed, unblinking, unseeing. They were the clearest blue, ringed with a darker halo, and they gleamed wetly in the dim light, as though she were awake, aware. Yet there was no life behind them, no spark of recognition when he gently leaned closer, his fingers moving with practiced care to lift one delicate lid further, as if to confirm what he already knew. The pupils responded, contracting slightly to the flare of his lamp, but there was nothing behind them. It was as if her mind had left her body behind, still breathing, still warm. He glanced at Elora, who stood nearby with her hands clutched tightly at her waist, her knuckles white against the black fabric of her gown. Her lips trembled, though no sound escaped them, and her eyes shimmered as though she fought tears she had long ago exhausted. Adrian's gaze returned to Lyora. He took her wrist gently in his hand, feeling the steady, slow pulse beneath skin so fine he could see the delicate lattice of veins. It was strong, regular, betraying no hint of strain or sickness. He moved carefully, his fingers tracing her jawline, his thumb brushing across her temple in a motion that should have roused a reaction of some kind. A flicker, a breath, caught, anything. There was nothing. Her breath came in slow, measured intervals, each exhalation shallow but even, as though she slept deeply. You say she simply stopped. Adrian's voice was soft, but the question hung heavily in the air between them. Elora's answer was slow in coming, her voice rough with wear and weariness. 3 weeks ago, she said, and the words sounded like they had been spoken many times before, rehearsed and retold to empty rooms and unhearing ears. She was well the night before, quiet, but Lyora was always quiet. She'd gone walking in the woods that evening. She said something called to her, though she couldn't say what. Her fingers twisted at the hem of her sleeve as she spoke, her gaze fixed not on Lyora, but on some place far away, deep inside memory. When she came back, she seemed different, distracted. She said there was a voice she could hear, but only when she closed her eyes. A woman whispering her name. Adrian felt a prickle at the base of his skull, but he said nothing, his attention returning to the girl on the bed. And then, he prompted. Elora's throat worked as she swallowed. And then, the next morning, she didn't wake. Her eyes were open just as they are now, but she wasn't there anymore. There was a tremor in her voice at the last words, a tightness that betrayed a depth of sorrow and fear he knew well. He had seen it before, in families of the terminally ill, and loved ones left behind by those trapped inside broken bodies and silent minds. But this was different. There was no sickness here, no injury. Lyora was whole, only absent. There was no fever, Elora continued, her voice lower now, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something delicate. No fits, no injury. She simply disappeared. Adrian's gaze returned to Lyora, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, the faint flush at her cheeks that suggested peaceful slumber, even as her wide-open eyes told a different story entirely. He tested her reflexes again, gently lifting her arms, allowing them to fall softly back to the bed. There was movement, the automatic responses intact, yet there was no volition, no will. The body lived, the mind was gone. "Have you spoken to anyone else?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Elora shook her head slowly. "No one here understands, they think." She trailed off, swallowing again. "Some say she's cursed. Others think she's been taken by something in the woods. Our family has always been different. The villagers have whispered about us for years." Adrian closed his eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath, steadying himself against the unease that clawed at him from inside. He had come here thinking this might be an unusual case of catatonia, a rare but not impossible condition. But what he saw now defied even his broad understanding. Lyora's condition was not the stillness of the body's choice or defense, it was emptiness. A vessel unfilled. "What did she say about the voice?" he asked after a long silence. Elora's eyes flickered with something fear, perhaps. She said it was calling her name, but she couldn't understand the words. She said it sounded sad, pleading, like it wanted her to follow. The air in the room seemed colder then, though the fire in the grate had not dimmed. Adrian rubbed his thumb absently across the back of Lyora's hand. noting the warmth, the living softness of her skin. He resisted the urge to speak her name aloud, as if by doing so he might rouse her. Instead, he asked quietly, "And has anyone else heard it?" "I thought I heard something once. The night before she fell into this state, I was outside in the garden. There was a sound, soft, like singing, a woman's voice, but it was coming from the woods." Adrian turned his head slightly at that. The woods. He had seen them from the carriage, a dense expanse of dark trees that crowded close to the edge of the estate, as if pressing against an unseen barrier. "Has anyone searched the forest?" he asked. Elura's smile was faint and sad. "No one goes in there after dark. Not anymore." He considered that, filing it away as he returned his attention to Leora. Carefully, he reached into his valise and removed a slender metal instrument, placing the earpieces of his stethoscope into his ears. He pressed the diaphragm lightly to her chest, just above her heart, and listened. The sound was steady, regular, unremarkable. He moved the instrument to her throat to listen to the flow of breath through her windpipe. Again, there was nothing unusual. He felt the odd sensation of performing a routine examination on someone who was anything but routine. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to a small silver chain that lay around Leora's neck, mostly hidden beneath the neckline of her nightgown. Elora nodded, and he gently drew it out. At the end of the chain hung a pendant, an intricately worked disc of silver, marked with a design he did not immediately recognize. It was warm to the touch, as though it had been lying in the sun, and he frowned faintly as he studied it. There were runes around the edge, ancient ones he vaguely recalled from his studies long ago, though he could not place their meaning. "It was our mother's," Elura said softly. "She gave it to Leora when she turned 16. Said it was meant to protect her." Adrian ran his thumb over the pendant once more, before lowering it gently back against Leora's chest. "Did your mother believe in such things?" he asked. Elora gave another faint smile. "She believed in many things. Some of them I thought were only stories." Adrian nodded slowly, his mind turning over the possibilities. Stories had power in places like this, he knew, and sometimes stories were more than they seemed. He rose at last, his movements slow and deliberate. "I need time," he said again, though he did not quite know what he was searching for yet. Elora only nodded, her gaze dropping to her sister's unmoving face. "Whatever you need," she murmured. "Just bring her back." And in her voice, Adrian heard not desperation, but a deep, abiding love that would not be broken by fear or doubt. He left the room quietly, his heart heavier than it had been when he entered. Behind him, Leora's empty eyes remained fixed on the darkness above her bed. Unblinking, Doctor. Adrian Mercer returned to Leora's room the following morning, after a night of restless sleep filled with fragmented dreams he could not quite recall. The morning light was pale, diffused through leaded windows streaked with the residue of long-forgotten rains, casting a colorless hue over the furnishings and Leora herself. She had not moved in the hours he'd been away. Not even her gaze had shifted, still pinned to that distant place somewhere beyond sight or comprehension. Adrian crossed the threshold quietly, feeling the subtle weight of the house press upon him again, as though the walls themselves were listening, aware of his every footfall. Elora was already seated beside the bed when he entered, her hand resting lightly atop her sister's, as if to anchor her in the world she had left behind. Her eyes lifted briefly to Adrian's, and he caught in them a flicker of something fragile but resilient, hope, perhaps, or the exhaustion of someone determined to endure for as long as she was needed. He set his leather valise down on a nearby chair, its brass buckles glinting dully, and opened it with a soft sigh, withdrawing his instruments with practiced care. His fingers brushed over the worn wood of his reflex hammer, the polished steel of his tuning fork, the fine bone-handled scalpel that had once been the pride of his surgical days. None of them would be useful here. He left them undisturbed and instead took a small notepad, an ink pen, and a lamp. Turning to Elara, he spoke quietly, as if raising his voice might shatter something delicate. "I'll begin now," he said. She nodded and moved her chair back slightly, but did not release her hold on Leora's hand. Adrian pulled the lamp closer and adjusted its flame, brightening the pool of light that spilled across Leora's unmoving features. Her expression was serene, almost too serene, the fine arch of her brows and the faint blush at her lips rendering her doll-like in the flickering illumination. He lifted one of her hands gently from the coverlet, holding it lightly between his fingers, feeling again the warmth of her skin. There was no stiffness, no sign of atrophy, no loss of circulation. The muscles were supple, the tendons relaxed. He pressed lightly at the pads of her fingers, searching for any resistance, but her hand remained limp, pliable. Setting it carefully back down, he turned to her eyes once more. He reached for his ophthalmoscope, leaning in to inspect the dilated pupils. The momentary constriction to light was present, but sluggish, as though reacting from a great distance. "No change," he murmured, mostly to himself, making a brief notation in his book. Elara watched with rapt attention, her breath shallow as though fearing to disturb the fragile balance of the moment. Adrian placed 2 fingers beneath Leora's jaw, feeling the steady rhythm of her pulse there, then shifted to her wrist, confirming consistency. No irregularities. Her heart was strong, her body alive in every measurable sense, and yet he was struck again by the emptiness of her gaze. It was not merely the absence of focus, it was the absence of presence. He retrieved a thin silver needle from his kit, sterilized it quickly over the flame of the lamp, and then pricked lightly at the pad of Leora's index finger. A single bead of bright red blood welled up from the puncture, but there was no flinch, no sign of discomfort. Elora's fingers tightened over Leora's other hand at the sight, but she said nothing. Adrian took a small strip of linen and dabbed away the drop, satisfied that her circulatory system was intact, but no closer to understanding why she remained locked away in this state. He moved next to her feet, gently pressing at the soles, then using his knuckles to test her plantar reflex. There was no withdrawal, no sign of a response. He paused, sitting back slightly, rubbing his temple with the heel of his hand. "There should be something," he muttered, barely audible. Elora's voice was soft but sure when she spoke. "I told you. She's not here." Adrian glanced at her, seeing the raw certainty in her gaze. He had heard such things before, in different contexts, people speaking of lost loved ones, convinced their spirits had departed long before their bodies followed. But this was different. Elora was not speaking metaphorically. She believed it, and then the evidence seemed to support her. He returned his focus to Leora. There was one more test he could perform, though it would offer no more scientific explanation than anything else he had tried. He turned back toward Elora. "Hold her hand," he instructed gently. She did so without hesitation, her fingers threading through her sister's slender ones. "Talk to her. Tell her you're here." Elora's throat worked around a tightness that had clearly been there for days, if not weeks, but she drew a breath and leaned close to Leora's ear. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but the words were thick with longing. "Leora," she said, and her thumb stroked gently along the back of her sister's hand. "It's me. I'm here. You can come back now. Please come back." Adrian watched closely as Elora spoke, his gaze flicking from her lips to Leora's face. He saw no change at first, no shift of expression, no flicker of awareness in those frozen eyes. But then, from the corner of his vision, he noticed something else. A single bead of moisture welled slowly at the corner of Leora's left eye and traced a glistening path down the curve of her cheek. Adrian's breath caught. Elora sighed at the same time and let out a soft, broken sound that was half gasp, half sob. She squeezed Leora's hand more tightly, her voice gaining urgency. "Leora, please. I'm here. I love you. Please come back to me." Another tear slid down Leora's face, though her eyes did not move, and the muscles of her face remained slack. Adrian took his pen and scrawled quick, almost frantic notes on the page beside him. "Emotional response," he wrote. "Reflexive or conscious?" He reached for his lamp again and flicked it close to her pupils. They remained slow, unchanging. He replaced the lamp and studied her pulse again, finding no change there either. Whatever part of Leora had reacted, it was not enough to bridge the gap between them. "She can hear you," Adrian said quietly, his voice edged with something he did not quite understand. Hope? Desperation? "She's aware at some level." Elora wiped at her own eyes with trembling fingers, then turned her focus entirely to Leora. She continued to speak, soothingly now, softly, repeating words of comfort and love. Adrian sat back heavily in the chair by the bed, watching the quiet exchange, his mind racing through every possible explanation. He thought of deep catatonia, of locked-in syndromes, of rare seizures and fugue states, but none fit perfectly. There was an intelligence here still, some faint spark trapped beneath the ice. He closed his notebook slowly, feeling the strange, familiar tug in his chest, the old need to fix what was broken, to heal what was wounded, to bring back what had been lost. But this was different from anything he had encountered in his long career. He had seen many patients caught on the border between life and death, but Leora was not caught between life and death. She was somewhere else, and he feared he would need to cross a boundary of his own to find her. He rose from the chair at last, laying his hand gently atop Leora's for a moment, feeling the warmth there, the faint pulse of life beneath the skin. "I'll find a way," he promised quietly, unsure if the words were for her or for himself. Elora's gaze followed him as he gathered his instruments. "Will she wake up?" she asked, her voice thin and raw. Adrian paused at the door, his hand resting lightly on the frame, his eyes distant. "She's alive," he said at last, "and she can still feel you." It wasn't an answer, but it was all he had. He left the room with the weight of their shared hope heavy on his shoulders. The house was heavy with silence as night fell fully across the Hawthorne estate. its corridors cloaked in deepening shadows, the ticking of an old grandfather clock down the hall marking time with solemn precision. Dr. Adrian Mercer sat hunched over a broad oak desk in the study, the dim glow of an oil lamp illuminating the yellowed pages of journals and notebooks that bore the faded imprint of his own handwriting from years, sometimes decades past. The air smelled faintly of dust, aged leather, and the lingering hint of something damp that came from the old stone of the house itself. His spectacles slid low on his nose as he flipped through the brittle pages, his eyes burning with fatigue but refusing to close. He had brought with him only a few of his old casebooks, but now Elora had provided him with others' boxes from the estate's long-forgotten library, tomes belonging to her ancestors, some physicians, some scholars of stranger pursuits. At first, he had dismissed them as irrelevant, the kind of superstitious nonsense that often clung to places with long histories and older griefs. But as the hours passed and his own explanations failed him, he found himself returning again and again to certain phrases that echoed through those forgotten writings. Between places, unmoored spirit, the veil thin. He sighed and rubbed his eyes before reaching again for a familiar journal of his own, a brown leather-bound volume whose cover was softened and worn from years of handling. In its pages, he had recorded cases from the latter part of his career, patients who had slipped into comas without injury, without infection, without explanation. He had written them off then as unsolvable mysteries, uncomfortable footnotes to an otherwise logical profession. Yet here, now, Leora's unblinking eyes haunted him with a familiarity he could no longer ignore. He flipped to one page in particular, remembering the man it described. William Carter, 32 years old, found lying unconscious in his garden on a summer morning, no sign of illness or trauma, his vital signs stable, his body unmarked. But his eyes, Adrian's penmanship wavered on that line, eyes open yet empty, unresponsive yet not blind. William had remained that way for 42 days. On the 43rd, his wife claimed to hear him whisper her name in the night, and on the 44th, he died. Adrian had performed the autopsy himself, found no cause of death beyond an otherwise healthy heart that had simply stopped beating. But William's wife had said something that Adrian had dismissed at the time, something that returned now with an unsettling weight. He was already gone, she had told him. He was never really here. Adrian pressed his fingertips to his temples as if he might force clarity through the pressure alone. He exhaled slowly and opened another volume, this one older, its pages brittle, the ink faded to the color of old blood. He found the passage he had half remembered and traced it with his finger, lips moving silently as he read. There are places where the boundaries of the world thin like worn cloth, and in such places a soul may slip between. Not dead, but not alive as we know it. Not here, yet not entirely gone. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, his mind turning over the words with growing urgency. Could it be that Leora's condition was not a medical anomaly, but something far older and more mysterious? He had never been a man of superstition, but the facts remained uncooperative. She was alive in every measurable way, and yet it was as if her consciousness had slipped from her body, caught between states of being. The phrase came back to him again, from another dusty page he had skimmed earlier that evening. The in-between, that was what the old texts called it. A place neither here nor there. A place one could be lost in. He thought of the tears that had escaped Leora's motionless eyes as Elora pleaded with her. Some part of her was still aware, still feeling, but trapped. Adrian stood abruptly and moved to the fireplace, staring into the cold hearth as if answers might be found in the soot and stone. What held her there? Why had she slipped away in the first place? He turned back to the desk and took up his pen, scribbling down the fragments of theory that came to him in fits and starts. Trauma? No sign. Illness? None detected. External force? Unlikely. Internal withdrawal? Possible. But why? What could drive a mind to abandon its body? What exists beyond grief? Beyond fear that could lure someone into the space between? He thought of Leora as Elora had described her before the coma. Bright, joyful, filled with laughter. There was no history of melancholy or despair. No loss, no broken heart that might explain such retreat. And yet something had taken her, or perhaps called her. He frowned, his fingers tightening around the pen until it creaked faintly in protest. Elora had mentioned dreams, hadn't she? Strange ones, recurring nightmares before Leora had fallen silent. She spoke of voices in her sleep, of shadowed places she had never seen but feared deeply. Adrian rifled through his notes again, searching for the details. Yes, Elora had said. Leora described someone calling her name from the dark, pleading, but not in a human voice. Adrian felt a chill crawl up his spine at the recollection. What if those dreams had not been dreams at all, but invitations? His rational mind recoiled from the idea, but his instincts whispered otherwise. He thought of ancient myths, Orpheus descending into the underworld to reclaim Eurydice, shamans traveling in trance between worlds. Perhaps Leora had crossed some threshold in sleep or in waking and had not found her way back. He wrote the word retrieval on the page before him, underlining it twice. If someone could cross into the in-between, someone might be able to bring them back. But how? His eyes swept over the open volumes on the desk. Rituals, most of them outdated or impossible. He found mention of symbolic acts, a tether to the world left behind, something to guide the lost spirit home. The old stories spoke of voices, names called with love and certainty, objects of deep personal meaning. He thought of Ilara, how Leora's tears had come only when her sister spoke. That was a tether, he realized, but not enough, not yet. He stood again, pacing the length of the room, his footsteps muffled by the threadbare rug beneath his boots. His mind spun with ideas, half-formed and desperate. Perhaps he could induce a trance state in himself, something akin to deep meditation. Perhaps he could reach her, if only briefly. But it would be dangerous. He knew enough of altered states of consciousness to understand the risks, seizures, coma, the possibility of not returning at all. Yet even as he considered the danger, he felt his resolve harden. He would not let Leora fade, as William Carter had faded. He would not sit by while another life slipped quietly into the dark. He turned back to the desk and gathered his notes, assembling them into a loose plan. He would need Elara's help. Her voice, her presence, her connection to Leora would be essential. And something of Leora's, a personal object of deep significance. Adrian closed his journals and snuffed out the lamp, the house falling into darkness save for the pale moonlight filtering through the high windows. He stood for a long moment, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. He whispered softly into the night, as if testing the idea aloud. Between worlds. The words hung in the air, unanswered, but not unnoticed. He could feel it, the house listening, the boundary thinning, and something waiting on the other side. The morning light was thin but golden, spilling through the high windows of Hawthorne Estate and casting fractured patterns across the dust-laden floors. Adrian Mercer stood silently in Leora's room for a long while, watching her fragile chest rise and fall with slow, mechanical precision. Her skin, pale as the ghost stories that clung to this old house, seemed almost translucent in the early light, and her wide, unblinking eyes reflected nothing of the world around her. Yet, somewhere deep within, Adrian was certain she was still there, trapped, waiting, caught in a place neither fully alive nor truly gone. He turned toward Elora, who hovered in the doorway, her hands twisting together, her expression caught between exhaustion and fading hope. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision settle fully onto his shoulders. "Elora," he said quietly, "I want to try something different." She frowned, stepping farther into the room, eyes darting to her sister as if afraid Adrian might do something reckless. "What do you mean?" she asked, though her voice carried the thinnest thread of hope. "I think we need to remind her of who she is, where she belongs," he said, choosing his words with care. "We need to show her something familiar, something that meant life to her." He gestured toward the garden beyond the window, its wild tangle of roses and ivy and crumbling statues, almost beautiful beneath the soft spring sunlight. "You told me she loved that garden, played there, found peace there." Elora nodded slowly, her gaze moving to the overgrown path winding beneath the ancient oaks. "She did," she whispered. "She spent hours there when we were children, and after our mother died, that's where she went to feel close to her." Adrian's heart ached quietly at that revelation, but it only confirmed what he suspected. "Then we need to take her there," he said. "Let her feel the air, the sun, the familiar earth beneath her. It might be enough to call her back, or at least show her the way." Elora hesitated only a moment longer before nodding, a sudden urgency rising in her posture. "Yes," she said, stepping to the side of the bed. "Let's do it now." Together they worked gently, lifting Leora's still form from the bed, careful of her thin limbs and fragile frame. Adrian was struck by how light she was, as if whatever anchored her to this world had already begun to loosen its grip. But as Elora cradled her sister's head,
and they wrapped her in a soft shawl against the morning chill, there was something fiercely protective in her touch, a tether of love, as ancient and strong as anything Adrian could have hoped for. Slowly, they carried her through the house, the floorboards creaking softly beneath their careful steps, down the wide staircase, and through the cavernous front hall. The doors groaned in protest as Adrian forced them open, the iron hinges long stiff with rust. Beyond, the garden waited, wild and tangled, but still vibrant beneath its veil of neglect. The air was cool and sweet, carrying the faint scent of honeysuckle and damp earth. They moved to an old stone bench near the center of the garden, beneath an arch of climbing roses. The blooms, pale and soft, nodded gently in the breeze, as if welcoming them back. They laid Leora there, her head resting in Elara's lap, her body stretched out like a figure carved from marble. For a long moment, nothing changed. Adrian watched the rise and fall of her chest, the stillness of her gaze, searching for anything, a flicker, a shiver, a sign. Elara smoothed back Leora's dark hair, whispering softly to her, words of childhood, of memory, of love. "We're in the garden now, Leora," Ilara murmured, her voice thick with tears she refused to shed. "Do you remember? You used to dance here. You made me crowns of daisies, do you remember?" The breeze picked up slightly, stirring the loose strands of Ilara's hair and setting the roses to swaying. Adrian closed his eyes and reached for Leora's wrist, feeling the steady, quiet thrum of her pulse. "She's here," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "She's here. She just doesn't know how to come back." Then something changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Ilara drew in a sharp breath as she felt it too. Leora's fingers twitched, just once the faintest flutter, and then lay still again. But it was enough. Ilara's tears spilled freely now as she bent close to her sister's face. "You're here," she whispered. "You're here with me." Adrian kept his hand on Leora's wrist, his other gently lifting her hand to place a small object in it, a smooth river stone, worn by years of handling, that Ilara said Leora had carried with her since childhood. "Hold it," he murmured. "Feel it. Know where you are." The stone rested in her palm, and for a long moment there was only silence save for the breeze and the quiet hum of distant bees. Then another twitch. Her fingers curled slightly, as if remembering the act of grasping. Ilara sobbed softly, her joy and fear tangled together. Adrian fought to keep his voice calm, though his heart pounded hard against his ribs. "Leora," he said gently, leaning closer. "You're not alone. Your sister's here. You're safe. You're home." And then, so slowly it was almost painful to watch, her eyelids fluttered. Not much, not fully closing, but there was movement. And more than that, her pupils seemed to shift, ever so slightly, as if focusing. Adrian let out a slow breath, his hands steady despite the racing of his pulse. "That's it," he said softly. "That's it, Leora." Ilara continued to speak to her sister, recounting stories of their childhood, of their mother's garden, of the silly songs they had sung while weaving flowers into each other's hair. With each word, there seemed to be a deepening of color in Leora's pale cheeks, a faint warmth returning to her skin. Adrian remained vigilant, watching, waiting, knowing this was just the beginning. But it was something, a ray of hope. As the sunlight filtered through the tangled branches above, it painted patterns of gold and green across Leora's face. And for the first time in weeks, her lips parted. No sound came, no breath beyond the one she already took. But the motion was there. An attempt. A beginning. Adrian exchanged a glance with Ilara, who was crying in earnest now, clutching Leora's hand between both of hers. "She's coming back," Ilara whispered. "I know she is." Adrian nodded slowly, but his thoughts were already moving forward. This was a sign, yes, but not a guarantee. Whatever held Leora still lingered, and the path back might not be as simple as sunlight and memory. But for now, in this moment, they had hope. The days that followed were marked by a quiet, persistent devotion, as Ilara sat faithfully by her sister's side beneath the ancient boughs of a garden, her voice weaving stories and songs through the soft air like threads in an old tapestry. It began in the earliest light of morning, when mist still curled low along the ground and dew painted each blade of grass in silver. Ilara would guide Leora's frail body from the high, shadowed room she had lain in for so long and out into the wilder world where sunlight kissed the earth. Together, she and Adrian carried her carefully, always wrapped in the same pale shawl, to the stone bench near the rose arbor, a place Leora had once claimed as her own kingdom as a child. And there Ilara would begin, her fingers gently braiding strands of her sister's dark hair, or holding her hand, as she whispered stories of simpler days, tales of the summers they spent building tiny boats from sticks and leaves to float in the brook that bordered their childhood home, of secret forts they had made in the hollow of an old oak tree where they had sworn sisterhood oaths and made up new names for themselves, and of the winter nights they had shared under a single quilt, whispering dreams to one another long after the lamps had been extinguished. Her words were patient, melodic, rich with the warmth of memory, each syllable a thread stretching backward to a time when everything was whole. And when words seemed not enough, Ilara sang, her voice soft but sure, shaping lullabies their mother used to sing while sitting at her embroidery in the parlor, songs that once drifted through the open windows of their old home as they played in the garden. Sometimes her voice wavered, catching on sorrow or exhaustion, but she always found her melody again, continuing even when tears slid silently down her cheeks. Adrian, ever watchful, sat nearby in the garden's filtered light, his journal open on his knee, his fountain pen ready to record any hint of progress, no matter how slight. And there were changes, subtle as the faintest ripple, upon still water. On the third morning, as Alara hummed an old nursery rhyme about a silver swan, Adrian saw it, the faintest quiver of Leora's eyelids, as if stirred by a distant breeze. He made no announcement, simply noted it down, his fingers steady even as his pulse leapt. The following day, Alara told the story of their first harvest festival, describing how Leora had once worn a crown of woven wheat and danced barefoot in the orchard, laughing wildly as the sun set in golden ribbons behind her. As Alara spoke, Leora's fingers shifted where they lay loosely curled in her sister's palm. Just a twitch, but deliberate enough that Alara stopped mid-sentence, staring in wonder before tears blurred her vision. "Do you feel that, Adrian?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She heard me. She remembers. Adrian nodded solemnly, but did not interrupt, his eyes never leaving Leora's pale face as he watched for the next sign. And there was more. Over the days that followed, her breathing deepened, her cheeks took on the faintest flush, and though her gaze remained distant and unfocused, Adrian swore there was something behind those glassy eyes now, a flicker of life struggling toward the surface. He adjusted their routine, gently encouraging Alara to vary the cadence of her songs, to touch Leora's hands with different textures, soft velvet from her old doll, smooth river stones, fragrant herbs from the garden they once tended together. Every moment, every sensation was a breadcrumb scattered along the path they hoped Leora might follow home. They bathed her hands in warm rose water in the afternoons and cooled her brow with lavender-scented cloths in the evenings. And always Alara spoke to her. She described in painstaking detail the rooms of their childhood house, the creak of the floorboards, the way the light fell through the parlor windows on winter mornings. She reminded Leora of the time they had saved an injured robin together and nursed it back to health, how they had watched it fly again for the first time, triumphant. She told her about the night they had both snuck out to watch a meteor shower and made 1,000 wishes neither could remember now. Adrian marveled at Alara's unwavering hope, her fierce love made manifest in each word and note, and he wondered if such devotion had power beyond what science or reason could explain. He dared to believe it might. On the 7th evening, as twilight deepened and the garden filled with the sound of distant nightjars, Adrian saw Leora's hand curl fully around the small river stone Alara had placed there days before. The movement was slow, deliberate, and undeniable. Alara gasped and clutched at her sister's fingers, tears spilling freely down her face. "Leora," she breathed, her voice trembling. "You're holding it. You're holding on." Adrian stepped forward, his heart thundering in his chest. He placed 2 fingers gently at Leora's throat, feeling the steady pulse beneath her skin, stronger now, sure. He looked at Alara, his expression grave but tinged with hope. "She's responding," he confirmed softly. "Her body remembers. Now we have to help her mind." And so they continued, each day a careful ritual of story and song, touch and scent, memory and love. The house seemed to lighten with each small victory, the halls less shadowed, the rooms less oppressive. Even the garden bloomed more fully, its wild roses brighter, as if awakened by the return of something once lost. Adrian found himself believing in the impossible, in the thin threads of connection that might bind a soul back to its body if only someone loved enough to hold on. And Alara, she sang until her voice was hoarse, whispered until her throat ached, held her sister's hand until the bones in her own fingers ached, but never once did she let go. As the moon rose over Hawthorne Estate, casting silver light over the ivy-choked stones and tangled hedgerows, the sisters sat together beneath the arbor. One silent, still fighting her way back from whatever distant shore she had wandered to, and the other waiting, loving, singing her home. The 7th day at Hawthorne Estate dawned with a hush in the air, as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to break the long, aching silence that had filled its halls for weeks. Outside, the sky was cloudless and pale, casting a soft light over the ivy-strangled stonework and the tired garden beyond. Inside, Alara rose before the sun, her movements careful and reverent as she prepared for the day ahead. She bathed Leora's face with warm water, scented with rose and chamomile, brushing her sister's dark hair back from her brow with the same gentleness she had once practiced when they were girls and played dress-up in their mother's old gowns. Adrian watched quietly from the doorway of the sick room, noting the new color rising faintly in Leora's cheeks, the steadier rhythm of her breath as her chest rose and fell beneath the pale linen blanket. It was change, slow and fragile, but it was enough to spark hope in them both. As they had done every day before, Ilara and Adrian lifted Leora together and carried her out to the garden, to the stone bench beneath the ancient arbor where the roses, once untended and wild, now seemed to bloom with renewed life. Ilara settled beside her sister, arranging her carefully so her head rested gently against Ilara's shoulder. They had done this now for 6 days straight, speaking to her, singing the songs of their childhood, recounting stories filled with laughter and light. But today, something in the air felt different. The hours slipped by quietly, the soft hum of insects and the occasional trill of a songbird filling the spaces between Ilara's words. Adrian remained nearby, his pen scratching softly against the pages of his journal as he chronicled every movement, every faint flicker of change he witnessed in Leora. As the day waned and the sky began its slow transformation into a palette of burning oranges, dusky purples, and deep crimson, Ilara felt an old fear stir in her chest. What if they had reached the limit of what love and memory could do? What if this was as close as they would ever come? But she pushed the fear aside, holding fast to the belief that had carried her this far. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Ilara took Leora's hand in both of hers and began to hum the lullaby their mother had once sung to them on nights when the wind howled against the shutters and the world seemed full of shadows. It was an old, simple tune, only a few soft notes strung together, the words gentle and comforting as a hand smoothing back a frightened child's hair. Her voice, though tired, never wavered. "Sleep now, my darling, the stars keep their watch. Sleep now, my darling, in dreams softly caught." She sang it again and again, each repetition weaving itself around them like a warm, protective blanket. Adrian sat still as stone nearby, scarcely daring to breathe. And then, as the song drifted into a delicate hush and Ilara let the final note fade into the twilight, something happened. Leora's fingers, which had rested slack and still in Ilara's grasp for so long, tightened. Not with a random twitch or involuntary spasm, but a slow, purposeful squeeze that sent a shiver up Ilara's spine. Her breath caught, and for a heartbeat, she thought she had imagined it. But then she felt it again, the undeniable pressure of Leora's hand wrapping around hers, holding on with the faint but fierce grip of someone coming back from very far away. "Adrian," Ilara whispered, her voice tight with wonder and fear. He was already on his feet, crossing the garden to kneel beside them. Leora's hand trembled in Ilara's, and slowly, agonizingly, her lips parted. A faint breath escaped them, and then, so soft Ilara almost missed it, her sister spoke. "Ilara." It was little more than a whisper, a faint stirring of air against her sister's skin, but it was unmistakable. Ilara let out a sound between a sob and a laugh, tears spilling freely down her face as she leaned in close, pressing Leora's hand to her cheek. "I'm here," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm right here, Leora." Adrian was already checking her pulse, his fingers steady, but his hands shaking ever so slightly. Her heartbeat was stronger now, each beat steady and certain, no longer the fragile, thready rhythm he had first noted when he arrived at Hawthorne Estate. "She's back," he said softly, his voice reverent, as though afraid that speaking too loudly might frighten her away again. Ilara looked down at Leora, whose eyes, once dull and distant, were slowly gaining clarity. The pupils, once fixed and unresponsive, now shifted, focusing on her sister's tear-streaked face. It was not immediate. There was confusion there, and exhaustion, as though every muscle in Leora's body were struggling to recall its purpose. But there was also recognition. She knew them. She was here. "You sang me home," Leora said, her voice raw and ragged from disuse. Ilara let out another sob, laughing through her tears. "Always," she said, "I would sing you home from anywhere." Adrian's throat tightened, and he looked away briefly, blinking hard before returning his gaze to the two sisters. He took a deep breath and gently squeezed Leora's wrist. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "You've been asleep for a long time, but you're home." Leora's eyes flickered toward him, faint recognition sparking there as well. She tried to speak again, but winced at the effort. Ilara shushed her softly, brushing hair from her forehead. "No need to rush," she whispered. "We have time now." And for the first time in weeks, the weight that had hung heavy over Hawthorne Estate began to lift. The shadows seemed to ease their hold. The garden felt warmer, brighter. Even the birds, silent for so many days, began to sing again, filling the twilight with a music that blended with Alara's fading lullaby. They stayed there in the garden long after the sun had set, Leora's head resting in Alara's lap, her breathing deep and steady. Adrian lit a lantern and set it nearby, the warm glow dancing over their faces as he watched over them. There was much still to understand: how Leora had become trapped in such a deep state of unconsciousness, what force had held her mind at bay, but for now they simply sat in the quiet wonder of her awakening. As the moon climbed high above the crumbling towers of Hawthorne Estate, casting its silver light over the garden below, Adrian allowed himself a rare smile. There was still a long road ahead, but this was hope made real. The dawn after Leora's awakening broke softly over Hawthorne Estate, casting a warm, golden light that filtered through the tall, arched windows of the manor house and painted the faded wallpaper in hues of honey and rose. It was as though the entire estate, once cloaked in an oppressive gloom, now exhaled a deep, grateful sigh. The creeping ivy on the walls seemed greener, the ancient trees less skeletal, and even the wind carried a gentler song as it wound its way through the cracked stones and tangled hedges. Inside, Alara sat in the sunroom with her sister nestled close against her side, unwilling to let go for fear that this miracle might slip away like a dream at dawn. Her arm remained looped protectively around Leora's shoulders, and her fingers, so often cold and anxious in recent weeks, were warm as they smoothed back the strands of dark hair from Leora's face. She could scarcely believe it was real. Leora's breathing was slow and even, no longer the eerie, automatic rhythm it had been during her long sleep, but full of life and quiet strength. Her pulse, which had once thudded faint and distant beneath fragile skin, now beat steady beneath Alara's fingertips as if to declare, again and again, "I am here." And though Leora's voice was still soft and her movements faintly trembling from weakness, there was no mistaking the clarity in her gaze, nor the recognition that passed between them with every glance. They had each other again, and for now that was enough. Adrian Mercer stood quietly at the edge of the room, watching them. He had always thought of himself as an observer in life, someone who remained at a distance to study and understand, yet in this moment his chest swelled with something more personal. He had been witness to countless moments of joy and sorrow throughout his career as a physician, had watched families fracture under grief and reunite in healing, but this was something rare and sacred. He knew instinctively that he was standing at the threshold of a moment neither sister would ever forget. Alara pressed a kiss to Leora's temple, her cheek wet with tears she no longer tried to hide. "You came back," she whispered, her voice breaking with both relief and wonder. Leora gave a small, weary smile and let her head rest against her sister's shoulder. "I heard you," she murmured in return. "Even when it was dark, I heard you." Alara's arms tightened around her, and for a time they said nothing else, letting the simple presence of one another fill the space where words could not reach. Adrian stepped forward at last, clearing his throat gently, and Alara looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but bright. "She's strong," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "She needs rest, nourishment, and time, but she's here." Alara nodded, her throat too tight for words. Together, they helped Leora from the sunroom to the sitting room, where a soft couch awaited. It was a slow process, each step halting, but Leora managed to keep herself upright with Alara's arm around her and Adrian's steady hand nearby. The air in the manor, once thick with damp and neglect, now seemed fresher, cleaner. Light spilled through the windows, as if it had been waiting for this moment to return, casting long beams across the faded rugs and worn furniture. They settled Leora onto the couch, covering her with a shawl, and Alara fetched a cup of warm broth that Adrian had prepared earlier. Leora's hands trembled as she took the cup, but with Alara's help, she managed to sip it slowly. Adrian watched her closely, noting the flush that began to creep back into her pale cheeks, the life that filled her face a little more with each passing hour. He allowed himself to relax by degrees, sitting nearby with his notes, but writing nothing. He realized, with a faint sense of surprise, that this was not a moment to record or analyze. It was a moment to simply witness. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its gentle warmth filling the room, and for the first time in weeks, Alara smiled without sadness behind it. The sisters spoke quietly together, their voices weaving memories and stories, and Adrian found himself listening without meaning to. They spoke of their childhood, of the times they had run laughing through these halls before the grief and the weight of years had draped the estate in shadows. Leora's voice was faint and hesitant at first, but grew stronger as the hours passed, her laughter soft but real when Alara reminded her of some mischief they'd once caused. The sound of it seemed to drive the last of the darkness from the room. At one point, Leora grew tired, her head nodding forward, and Alara carefully eased her down onto the couch, covering her with another blanket. Adrian stood and crossed to the window, looking out at the garden. He watched as the breeze stirred the branches of the old oak where they had sat during the long days of Leora's silence, and he marveled again at how quickly life could change. Behind him, he heard Alara hum the familiar lullaby once more, her voice gentle and full of peace. As twilight fell again over Hawthorne Estate, casting the sky in rich shades of amethyst and indigo, the house itself seemed to soften. The once stark lines of the high ceilings and heavy beams became warmer in the glow of the lanterns Alara lit. Shadows no longer loomed but retreated, leaving space for light and laughter. Adrian remained for the evening, sitting quietly with them, though he knew this was their time, not his. Alara insisted he share the stew she had managed to prepare, and they ate together in the sitting room, the sisters sharing stories while Adrian listened. Afterward, when Leora slept, Alara turned to him, her eyes wide with a gratitude too vast for words. She took his hand in both of hers, holding it tightly. "You brought her back," she said, her voice fierce with emotion. Adrian shook his head slowly. "You brought her back," he replied. "I only helped you find her." Alara smiled then, a bright, true thing that seemed to ease the last of the weight from her shoulders. That night, Adrian retired to his small room in the west wing of the estate, but he found it difficult to sleep. He sat by the window instead, staring out over the grounds. The estate was changing, not only in appearance but in spirit. Where once there had been silence and decay, now there was light and hope. In the days that followed, Leora grew stronger. Each morning, she was able to walk a little farther in the garden, to eat a little more at meals. Alara never left her side, and Adrian found himself lingering longer with each visit to check her progress. The sisters often sat on the old stone bench beneath the arbor, Alara reading aloud while Leora listened with closed eyes, her head tilted back to the sun. Adrian tended the roses in the garden during these times, pruning the long-neglected bushes until they bloomed in a riot of color, as though they too had been waiting for this renewal. One morning, as he worked, Leora joined him, kneeling beside the flower beds. Her hands were weak, but she helped him plant new seedlings, her fingers in the earth, as she smiled softly at him. "Thank you," she said simply, and Adrian met her gaze. "For what?" he asked. "For believing I could come back," she said. Adrian only nodded, understanding that there were no more words needed. Hawthorne Estate was no longer a place of endings, but of beginnings. And as the garden flourished, so too did the family within its walls, restored not by miracles alone, but by love, hope, and the stubborn courage to believe in the impossible. The morning of Adrian Mercer's departure arrived draped in a quiet stillness, as if the very air around Hawthorne Estate was reluctant to let him go. The rising sun filtered softly through the mist that hovered over the gardens, bathing everything in a pale, golden light that shimmered on dew-speckled leaves and the newly blossomed roses he had helped tend. For days, Adrian had lingered, walking the familiar halls of the estate alongside Alara and Leora, witnessing firsthand the slow but undeniable return of life to a place once frozen in sorrow. But now it was time to leave, and although he had always been a man who traveled lightly, he found his steps heavy as he crossed the polished floors of the main hall, the leather of his old satchel creaking quietly over his shoulder. He paused by the grand staircase, running his hand over the smooth wood of the banister, tracing the fine cracks worn into it by time and memory. He thought of the two sisters who had restored this place to something warm and alive, and for the first time in years, he felt the faint but unmistakable stirring of belonging, a feeling he had long believed lost. Alara was waiting for him by the heavy front doors, her hands folded over something small, her expression both solemn and radiant. She had braided her dark hair back from her face that morning, and though her clothes still bore the faint fray of old sorrow, her bearing was lighter, her movements graceful and sure. Leora stood beside her, leaning on a polished cane they had found in the old study, her cheeks no longer pale, but carrying a soft flush of color that spoke of returning strength. Her eyes met Adrian's with quiet understanding, as though she too knew the weight of goodbyes. Adrian stopped before them, offering a faint but genuine smile, his fingers tightening briefly on the strap of his satchel. "You've both come far," he said simply, his voice rougher than he intended. Ilara stepped forward then, holding out the object she carried. It was a small, delicate locket on a fine silver chain, its surface engraved with a pattern of intertwining vines and flowers that looked as though they might bloom under his touch. "This belonged to our mother," Ilara said softly, her fingers brushing his as she placed it in his palm. "She always said it carried hope inside it. I think she would have wanted you to have it." For a moment, Adrian simply stared at it, the metal warm from her hands and surprisingly heavy for something so small. He closed his fingers around it carefully, his thumb tracing the faintly worn engraving. "Ilara, he began, but the words tangled in his throat. She only smiled gently, her eyes glimmering with unshed tears, and shook her head. "You gave us back our family," she said, "and I think you found a part of yourself here too." Adrian exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest easing as he gave a soft nod. He slipped the locket into his pocket, resting it close to his heart. "Thank you," he murmured. Leora reached for his hand then, her fingers cool but steady as they closed briefly around his. "If you ever find yourself nearby," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "this will always be home." Adrian nodded again, the tightness in his chest no longer painful, but something deeper, fuller. He turned toward the door, his steps measured but certain, and Ilara opened it for him, the old hinges no longer protesting as they once had. Outside, the path that had once seemed so foreboding now lay bathed in soft light, framed by wildflowers and newly tended hedges. The gate that had grown shut behind him weeks ago now stood open, as though welcoming rather than warning. As he walked slowly down the stone path, Adrian glanced back once to see Ilara and Leora standing together in the doorway, watching him go. They raised their hands in farewell, and he returned the gesture with a quiet lift of his own before turning again toward the horizon. The air smelled faintly of lilac and something cleaner still, the promise of rain or renewal, he wasn't sure. With each step away from Hawthorne Estate, the weight of his years seemed to lift. The loneliness that had accompanied him for so long no longer pressed so closely. In its place was something unexpected and hard-won: hope. He reached into his pocket and brushed his fingers over the locket again, feeling its cool, smooth surface. He thought of the stories Ilara had shared about their mother, the way she believed it carried hope, and realized he believed it now, too. His path lay ahead, stretching into the distance where the road met the rising light of morning, but he no longer walked it alone. Hawthorne Estate faded behind him, no longer a place of sorrow and stillness, but home full of life and the promise of tomorrow. And as he made his way back toward Blackridge and whatever lay beyond, Adrian Mercer carried with him something he had not expected to find in the twilight of his years: a renewed purpose and the quiet certainty that he had been exactly where he needed to be.